Carol Byrd ran the ballot table in the Texas Student Union for 3 weeks every October. And in 50 years of telling the story afterward, she never once got through it without her voice cracking. It was October 1962, Austin, Texas, University of Texas campus. The contest was called The Ugly Man on Campus, a penny-a-vote fundraiser for campus chest charity. And by the second week, the ballot box on Carol's table held more pennies for one name than for any other name in the contest's 11-year history. That name belonged to a 19-year-old art major who wore no makeup, carried an auto harp to class, and had just discovered what 400 of her classmates thought of her, tallied on a corkboard, for anyone walking past to read on their way to lunch. What Janis Joplin did with that ballot box, and what she said to Carol 6 years later outside a Coliseum with 8,000 people screaming her name, is why this story survived. Rewind 6 weeks. Janis had arrived on campus that September with a portfolio of oil paintings, an auto harp case with a broken latch, and a chip on her shoulder the size of Port Arthur itself. She sat in the back row of her drawing classes, said little, sketched constantly. On Sunday nights, she sang at Threadgill's, the converted gas station on North Lamar, where the beer hall regulars called her the best thing they'd heard since the Carter family records on the jukebox. On campus, in daylight, among people her own age, she was something else entirely. Too loud for the sororities, too unwashed for the fraternities, too much for a school that measured its women by pledge class photographs. Carol, a work-study junior paying her own tuition on a scholarship that could vanish with one bad semester, had traded maybe a dozen words with Janis all told. A dropped pencil in the union stairwell, a comment about the heat. Once, in the cafeteria line, Janis had complimented the button Carol wore on her cardigan, a hand-painted daisy, something Carol had made herself and never expected anyone to notice. "You made that?" Janis had asked. "That's real work. Don't let anybody tell you different." Carol had thought about that sentence for days afterward. She liked Janis. She didn't know her, not really, but she'd already decided, without quite admitting it to herself, that she was on her side. The Ugly Man contest ran every fall, and everyone on campus treated it as harmless tradition. Students nominated names for a nickel, dropped pennies into a labeled box for a vote, and the winner, the name with the most pennies by the final Friday, got crowned at the campus chest carnival, wearing a cardboard tiara, to general laughter, and the money went to a children's charity downtown. Most years, the joke landed on a professor with a memorable mustache, or a senior who'd fumbled a game-winning pass in front of 40,000 people. This year, a cluster of agriculture majors nominated Janis Joplin on the very first day. "It's just a laugh," one of them told Carol when he dropped his first fistful of coins into her box. "She doesn't care about anything. She won't even notice." Carol watched the pennies pile up under Janis's name for 11 straight days. She watched classmates walk past the tally sheet taped to the corkboard, read it, and laugh. Not cruelly, most of them, just carelessly, the particular laughter of people spending nothing of their own. By the second week, Janis's tally had outpaced the next 4 names combined. "She's going to win the whole thing," Carol told her supervisor, a junior named Wanda who ran the union's charity drives. Wanda shrugged without looking up from her ledger. "It's a joke, Carol. Nobody actually thinks she's ugly. It's just pennies." Somebody had thought it enough to write her name down 400 times. Not 40, not 4. 400 separate pennies. 400 separate decisions, made one at a time by people who mostly never spoke to Janis at all. Janis found out on a Thursday afternoon, the way most people found things out in 1962, from a friend who'd already seen the board and assumed she knew. She hadn't. Carol was manning the table when Janis walked into the union that day, auto harp case banging against her leg, papers for a drawing assignment tucked under one arm. She stopped dead in front of the corkboard. The room went quiet around her, without anyone deciding to be quiet. It just happened, the way a held breath happens. Janis read the tally sheet. She read it twice, her lips moving slightly over the count. Then she laughed. But it wasn't the laugh Carol had heard drifting out of Threadgill's on a Sunday night. It was short. It didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "Well," Janis said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "at least I won something." Nobody clapped. Nobody knew what to do with a joke that had just refused, out loud, to stay a joke. A few students near the magazine rack looked away. Carol looked down at her own hands on the ballot box and felt, for the first time, ashamed of a job she'd been proud of that morning. That's when it happened. Carol watched Janis walk straight to the table, pick up the pen chained to the ballot box, and add one more entry to the tally sheet herself. Not her own name, but a different one. The name of the agriculture major who'd started the nomination in the first place. "Might as well make it interesting," Janis said, and dropped a single penny of her own into the slot. Then she picked her auto harp case back up and walked out of the union without looking at anyone, the door swinging shut behind her. Not slammed, just released, the way a person lets go of something they've stopped expecting anyone to hold open. Carol didn't sleep well that night, or the next. She kept replaying the sound of that door. 3 days later, word went around that Janis had withdrawn from 2 of her classes. By January, she was gone from Austin altogether, hitchhiking west toward California with a friend named Chet Helms, headed for a city where nobody had ever heard of the Ugly Man contest or cared what a corkboard in Texas had to say about anyone. Carol kept the tally sheet. She folded it into quarters, slid it inside her jewelry box beneath a class ring she hadn't earned yet, and carried it through 2 apartment moves and 1 marriage before she fully understood what she'd been keeping it for. 6 years is not a long time. It is long enough, it turned out, for a girl who left Texas with 1 guitar case, an auto harp, and $40 to become the loudest voice in American music. By the fall of 1968, Janis Joplin's face was on the cover of Newsweek. "Piece of My Heart" played on every radio station in the state that had once voted her ugliest. Big Brother and the holding company's Cheap Thrills sat at #1 on the Billboard chart nationwide, and when the tour schedule listed a stop at the Sam Houston Coliseum, tickets sold out faster than the box office could reprint them. Carol Byrd was 25 now, married, working as a secretary 2 counties east of Houston. She drove 4 hours with the folded tally sheet tucked into her purse, not entirely sure, even as she parked the car, why she'd brought it. She told herself it was just a concert, the way you tell yourself a lot of things on a long drive. She stood in a line that wrapped twice around the Coliseum, surrounded by strangers who, 6 years earlier, might have dropped a penny into that same box without a second thought, and who were now hoarse from screaming a name Austin had once turned into a punchline. She got backstage the only way anyone did in 1968, by knowing someone who knew someone. A stage manager from her old secretarial pool who owed her a favor from years back. Carol hadn't planned what she'd say. She just held the tally sheet out when Janis looked up from lacing a boot in a folding chair surrounded by amplifiers and road cases. "You probably don't remember me," Carol said. "I ran the ballot table, the Ugly Man contest, back at UT. I kept this." Janis went still. She took the paper from Carol's hand, unfolded it slowly, and read her own name written 400 times in 400 different pieces of other people's handwriting, and one line in her own hand, the entry she'd added herself, the joke she'd turned back on the boy who'd started it all. "I remember every single person who laughed," Janis said quietly. "I don't remember one who kept anything." She didn't cry. Janis rarely cried where people could see her do it. But she held that tally sheet against her chest for a long moment, the way you'd hold something you'd assumed was thrown away for good. And when she finally handed it back, her hand wasn't quite steady. Janis played nearly 2 hours that night. She dedicated nothing to nobody by name on stage. That was never her style, too much like asking for pity. But partway through Ball and Chain, she looked out past the stage lights toward the wings where Carol stood, and something passed between the two of them that the 8,000 people in the seats never noticed at all. Carol drove home at 2 in the morning with the tally sheet back in her purse and cried for most of the 4 hours. Not from sadness. She couldn't fully explain it to her husband when she got in. She could barely explain it to herself. Janis never spoke about the Ugly Man contest publicly, never named it in an interview, never turned it into an anecdote for a talk show host. But 2 years later, a magazine reporter asked her about growing up in Texas, and she gave an answer Carol read at her own kitchen table and recognized instantly. "Texas is okay if you want to sit on your ass and watch life go by," Janis told him. "But if you're going to go somewhere, you have to get out." The reporter printed it as a line about ambition, one quote among many in a longer profile. Carol read it as something narrower, something aimed at one particular corkboard. A woman who had once stood in a student union doing arithmetic on 400 pennies and decided the only vote that mattered from that day forward was the one she cast for herself, walking out a door that nobody was holding open for her. Janis Joplin died on October 4, 1970, in a motel room in Los Angeles, 2 years after that night at the Sam Houston Coliseum. Carol Byrd kept the folded tally sheet for the rest of her life. She had it framed eventually, alongside the ticket stub from that concert, and hung both in a hallway where visitors usually asked about them, assuming the yellowed ballot was some kind of joke memorabilia, a punchline salvaged from a bygone decade of college pranks. Carol corrected every single one of them the same way, in the same tone, for close to 50 years. "That's not a joke," she'd say, tapping the glass. "That's proof somebody was wrong." The University of Texas quietly retired the Ugly Man contest sometime in the 1970s, the way institutions tend to retire traditions once someone finally points at them directly and asks who they were ever supposed to be funny for. Most students who walk through that same Union hallway today have never heard the contest existed, let alone whose name once outpaced every other name in its history by a margin of 4-1. But in Port Arthur, in the Texas Hill Country, In the small clubs where Threadgill's regulars still trade stories over long-neck bottles, an older version of the tale gets told every so often, about a girl the campus voted ugliest, who left with one guitar case and $40 in her pocket, and who came back 6 years later to a ticket line that wrapped around a Coliseum twice. Carol Byrd used to end it the same way every single time she told it, one finger resting on the framed glass in her hallway. She never dressed it up. She never claimed she'd known, back in 1962, how the story would end. Nobody standing at that ballot table could have known that. She only ever said the one thing she was sure of, the thing 400 pennies had gotten wrong, and one folded piece of paper had eventually made right. 400 pennies, she'd say, and every one of them was wrong. If this forgotten piece of rock history moved you, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps stories like this one find the people who still need to hear them. And tell us in the comments, have you ever kept proof that someone was wrong about you, waiting for the day you could finally show them?